I am going to do something which I shouldn't do if I were a Hollywood guy, and that is tell you the ending before I even start. I actually hope to get across only a few important points today. Point number one, nuclear weapons are still a big threat to mankind and need to be dealt with. And the end of the Cold War did not end the threat that nuclear weapons present to mankind. Point number two, there's only one stable outcome for mankind, and that is to eliminate all nuclear weapons. No other outcomes, no regulatory approaches, no other diplomatic compromises will be stable in the long run. And if it's not stable in the long run, the chances eventually become 100% that another nuclear weapon gets used, and that will change history forever. Even if it's only a single nuclear weapon, it will change history. Point number three, eliminating all nuclear weapons is feasible, difficult but feasible. This is a result of changes that have occurred since the Cold War. Many people think it's a fanciful idea, and I'll try to convince you this afternoon that it's not fanciful, that it actually is feasible if you do it in the right way. So that's really all I hope to get across to you. There's many, many details, of course, and I'll summarize some of them in my presentation, and then we'll have a chance to interact back and forth and try to clarify some of the difficult points that I might have glossed over too quickly. I put these slides up. Please don't worry about having to read them. They're really to keep me from talking too long, and that's their main purpose. My first slide is to elaborate a bit why I think this is a problem that is urgent and still needs to be dealt with. Not many people actually understand how urgent it is. A lot of people understand we have an increased terrorist threat, but they don't realize how feasible it is for terrorists to build a nuclear weapon if they can get their hands on the material necessary, because the technology is out of the bag. It's not a secret anymore how to make nuclear weapons, and it's really not that hard, particularly if you can get what's called highly enriched uranium. We made a uranium bomb in World War II starting from scratch in a couple of years, and we were so confident that we used it on Hiroshima without ever testing it. I bet not many of you realize that we never tested the bomb we used on Hiroshima, because you heard about the test at Trinity. If you went to see the opera Dr. Atomic, it's all about how, oh, if only we hadn't tested at Trinity, there would never have been any nuclear explosions. That was the other bomb and the other technology, which is more complicated, the plutonium technology. But the uranium technology, even then, we didn't need to test it. So the terrorists don't need a test range. They don't need a whole lot of complicated equipment if they can get their hands on the material. There's still 25,000 active nuclear weapons in the world. That's a lot. We know that probably 2,000, maybe less, could destroy every major city on the planet. So 25,000 is a lot. And there's enough so-called special fissile material, either plutonium or highly enriched uranium, sitting around already to make 200,000 more. And as I said, the technology's out of the bag. So if you have that material, you can probably make the bomb. The Non-Proliferation Treaty, which was reached in 1968, that was supposed to prevent the further spread of nuclear weapons, has done some good. A lot of people think it's done a lot of good, but basically it hasn't worked as anticipated. We have 5 states that have actually developed nuclear weapons, in addition to Iran, that's close. I only put 4 of them up there: India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea. I didn't put South Africa up there because they reversed their program and got rid of all their weapons, but they did develop them, notwithstanding the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Israel, Pakistan, and India were not parties to the treaty. I don't think South Africa was either at the time. Later it became a party to the treaty. So they didn't sign up even at the beginning. And North Korea and Iran signed up, but have cheated a bit. The Non-Proliferation Treaty was also a grand compromise between the nuclear powers at the time and the states that did not have nuclear weapons. The compromise was, okay, we'll go along with the two-tiered world. a world in which there's 5 accepted nuclear powers and nobody else has nuclear weapons, but only if the 5 accepted nuclear powers agree to make a major effort to eliminate their nuclear weapons so we won't have a 2-tier world forever. Well, the non-nuclear powers increasingly don't trust that guarantee that's in Article 6 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And I want to emphasize here, a lot of people say, well, we need to get rid of nuclear weapons because Article 6 committed us to get rid of them. Well, there's technical arguments, legal arguments, a lot of arguments about that and exactly what it is. And actually, we need to get rid of nuclear weapons because it's in our strategic interest to get rid of nuclear weapons. It happens also to be a fact that not doing it undercuts the one treaty that we put in place to try to control nuclear weapons. But it's another reason why we can't count on the NPT. Finally, next, there's a lot of what are called loose nukes and loose materials. In other words, some nuclear weapons and some materials whose security is not 100%, and we're not confident that they can't be stolen, the weapons or the material can't be stolen. We see what happens. The United States Air Force got confused and loaded 4 nuclear bombs on an airplane just a couple years ago and thought they were conventional bombs here in the United States. So the idea that, all of the security is okay in Russia or Pakistan, for example, is really pretty fanciful. And as I've already said, the technological know-how to make these weapons has become widespread. And we know that Russia, which has the majority of all the nuclear weapons in the world, has returned to a pro-nuclear policy, saber-rattling, asserting that it needs its nuclear weapons against a lot of threats that it faces. Now, I'm not the only one who believes these things. Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, Bill Perry, former Secretary of Defense, Sam Nunn, a former chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, wrote a famous op-ed piece at the beginning of 2007 where they called for a world without nuclear weapons and efforts to get there. And this is my favorite quote from their article: "The world is now on a precipice of a new and dangerous nuclear era. Most alarmingly, the likelihood that non-state terrorists will get their hands on nuclear weaponry is increasing. Non-state terrorist groups with nuclear weapons are conceptually outside the bounds of a deterrent strategy." In other words, the strategy we used in the Cold War to give us reasonable confidence that these huge nuclear arsenals would not be used can't be used against terrorists, because the terrorists, we don't know where they are, we can't retaliate against them, at least not precisely, and they don't really care if we retaliate against them. They're willing to be suicide bombers, even in a grand sense, if necessary, to further their ideological goals of undercutting our whole Western way of life. Jeffrey Goldberg, one of my favorite authors for The Atlantic, and prior to that, The New Yorker, wrote a really wonderful op-ed piece in September in the New York Times, which went contrary to what everybody thought President Obama or President McCain, it wasn't known at that time, was going to have to deal with, in which he said the next president must do one thing and one thing only if he's to be judged a success. He must prevent al-Qaeda or an al-Qaeda imitator from gaining control of a nuclear device and detonating it in America. The nuclear destruction of Lower Manhattan or downtown Washington would cause the deaths of thousands or hundreds of thousands, a catastrophic depression, the reversal of globalization, a permanent climate of fear in the West, and the comprehensive repudiation of America's culture of civil liberties. I want to emphasize that last line, the comprehensive repudiation of America's culture of civil liberties. Now look at what happened after 9/11, which killed 3,000 people, and which was done with a technology and a threat that we knew how to handle and should have handled ahead of time. All we had to do was put secure doors on the pilot compartments, and we took care of that problem. That wasn't very hard to fix, actually. But look at what happened to some of our civil liberties. They're not that bad. We learned to live with it, but there definitely is a move against our civil liberties in the argument of security. Imagine what happened if we had a nuclear weapon going off. President Obama, what's on the White House website? Obama and Biden will set a goal of a world without nuclear weapons and pursue it. Nobody's ever said that before as president. They said, Yes, we had this goal. End of comment. Canada and Obama's speech in Berlin. Poorly secured nuclear material in the former Soviet Union or secrets from a scientist in Pakistan could help build a bomb that detonates in Paris. His point was, this is a problem that faces the entire globe, not just the United States. Let's join together to deal with it. All right, so how do we deal with it? I believe that we deal with it by embracing the concept of eliminating all nuclear weapons and doing what we have to do to get to zero. Why do we have to get to zero? Why can't we simply follow the Non-Proliferation Treaty, make some more reductions, get rid of a lot of the extra weapons that the U.S. and Russia has, talk Iran out of their program, cajole North Korea out of their program? By the way, all those things I just said, none of those are easy to do. So it's not like we have a choice of some easy things over here and a real hard thing, which is to get rid of all nuclear weapons over here. We've got some real hard things over here also, if we don't want to get rid of all nuclear weapons. I'll argue later on that some of those hard things are virtually possible that we think we can do instead of the harder thing of trying to get rid of all nuclear weapons. And so we're kidding ourselves about what's hard and what's easy. But here's some more specific reasons. The first reason is that nuclear weapons are legitimate. Now that may shock some of you, coming from somebody who says we ought to get rid of them all. Because a lot of people who say we ought to get rid of them all try to say that they're illegal, they're immoral. We should have an international legal convention that makes them illegal. And until we do that, we'll never get rid of them. To those people I say, well, who are you going to get to sign up to a legal convention that says they're all illegal that isn't prepared to give them up? Well, it's kind of hard to conceive of some nation signing up and saying, these are illegal, but I won't give mine up. Of course they won't do that. So actually, it's just as hard to get them to sign up and say they're illegal as it is to sign up and say, I'll get rid of them. Yet the reason they want to get them to sign up and say they're illegal is as a step on the way to getting rid of them. So, that's pretty stupid. Why not just get them to sign up to get rid of them in the first place, if that's what you're trying to do? More importantly, it's wrong, because nuclear weapons have served a very important role in United States security policy throughout the Cold War. They prevented a big war between us and the Soviet Union. They probably prevented the Soviet Union from continuing its advance across Europe that it started at the end of World War II as it advanced through the countries of Central Europe. And as Winston Churchill said, there's an iron curtain that fell across Europe at that time. Thank goodness there was an iron curtain in two directions and not one, and nuclear weapons did play a role in that. So, what is the legitimate use of nuclear weapons? There's only one legitimate purpose in my mind, and that is to deter the use of nuclear weapons by others. There's no other legitimate purpose. But there is that legitimate purpose. And as you'll hear as I go through this, that legitimate purpose of nuclear weapons has two very important impacts on the effort to get to zero. Because it's the only legitimate purpose, what it means is that if everyone will give up their nuclear weapons together, no one will be upset, because they have no need for their nuclear weapons if nobody else has any. Because their only legitimate purpose is to deter the use of nuclear weapons by others. So they don't need any if others don't have any nuclear weapons. So it's really our hope that that's the only legitimate purpose. But on the other hand, it also is what drives proliferation. Because what it means is that if any one state has nuclear weapons, if you don't have zero, another state will become concerned about that nuclear threat and will want their own nuclear weapons to deter it. So proliferation is inevitable as long as it starts. It continues. It may take years or decades before states say, well, this threat's really gotten serious, and the only way I'm going to be secure is to have my own nuclear weapons. Now, we have avoided this by providing a nuclear umbrella to Japan and Germany and other places and saying, don't worry, you don't need any because ours will do it for you. So there's ways around it. But we haven't avoided it in a lot of cases. We didn't avoid it for India, which was worried about China. We didn't avoid it for China, which was worried about Soviet Union, maybe us. We didn't avoid it for Pakistan, which was worried about India. If you look back and you say, why did we develop nuclear weapons in the first place? It was really because we were trying to deter what we thought was an emerging nuclear threat from Germany. So even we actually built our own nuclear program because of exactly this dynamic. And this dynamic will continue so long as there's any nuclear weapons. So that's reason number one, why only zero is stable. No other arrangements are stable. The second reason is that the two-tier non-proliferation treaty regime we have trying to regulate and control nuclear weapons is just not acceptable to many countries in the world. And I've already talked about this. And equal treatment for everybody implies zero for everybody. And that was basically the deal we made in 1968. And Iran, to this very day, uses this as an excuse for their programs, and many other powers do also. That's why India, Pakistan refused to join in the first place. And the third reason is that today nuclear power is in a very different position than it has been in the past. You can argue about whether we ought to have nuclear power plants or not have nuclear power plants. I actually don't think they contribute enough toward solving the climate change problem to make them worth the trouble. But that's my opinion, and it's not going to be the consensus opinion. A lot of people feel that we ought to do everything we can to deal with the climate change problem, and nuclear power can be made safe enough that we ought to allow it. Anyway, it is allowed. It's going to be allowed. It provides 75% of the electricity in France, something like 65% in Japan. So even our friends have lots of nuclear power plants, and there's going to be a lot more in the future. And the problem is that once you have nuclear power plants, and especially if you have the infrastructure to make the fuel for the nuclear power plants, you have pretty much everything you need to make nuclear weapons. So you have a so-called breakout capability. Within a year, 2 years, some people say as short as 6 months, once you have all that, you could make a nuclear weapon. So how do you control that? Even with our present regime. If you don't like the idea of zero because you think it's too hard to do, think about how hard it is if you're trying to control this in a world in which there isn't an effort to verify that nobody has anything. Think how much easier it is to verify that nobody has anything. I like to use the following imperfect analogy. Our colleague, Professor Paul Krugman, doesn't like the approach we're taking to solving the financial crisis. And he's written in the last couple of op-ed pieces that he actually thinks that the only solution is to eliminate all derivatives altogether. They cause the problem. And this whole idea that we're going to better regulate this stuff is nonsense. The only way you can ever regulate it is to make them all illegal, and then you can tell if somebody's cheating. But otherwise, it'll get out of hand, and it'll happen again in the future. The analogy is quite imperfect, but it's sort of similar to what I'm saying about nuclear weapons. It's a lot easier to validate zero than it is to validate some intermediate level. What's the current focus of U.S. policy? And by the current focus of U.S. policy, I am now including the incipient efforts of the Obama administration. Of course, North Korea and Iran, and there's no argument with that. We should continue the diplomacy that's underway and strengthen it. And the things that they're doing to strengthen that diplomacy are important. North Korea, of course, right now has popped back up to the top of the list, but they're both important. They're also trying to prepare for the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference in May of 2010. Otherwise, the treaty expires altogether because you have to renew it every 5 years if that's not a successful outcome. There's no argument with that. We shouldn't abandon this treaty because it's imperfect and it doesn't do all the things it ought to do. We should keep it in place. And the third thing they're doing is pursuing what they call their reset button with Russia. And Secretary Clinton announced after she met with the Russian foreign minister that we will have a replacement for the one remaining legally binding treaty, the START 1 treaty that has verification provisions in it. It was signed in 1991, and it expires this year in December. And that before it expires, we will have a replacement for that treaty in place. And the theory here is that between the United States and Russia, we have 90, maybe 95% of all the nuclear weapons in the world. And so that's the number one problem, is to get those numbers down. You'll hear me argue that it's not the number one problem. Because actually, yes, it's a problem, and yes, eventually we have to get them all down, and of course you can't go to zero until you get rid of those also. But the number one problem is to get the world to understand that we need to go to zero, and that in order to do that, we're going to have to do some things very differently than we've done in the past. And that's what we ought to be focused on. And getting a few more of the Russian weapons down is not the number one problem. So let me talk about what they're trying to do here. And I'm doing this as a way of illustrating how hard this problem is. Who could be upset about a new treaty with Russia that extends some verification on weapons and keeps the numbers down and keeps the U.S. and Russia from building up forces again? Why can you be upset about that? Well, what is this treaty all about? It was really the last Cold War treaty, and it has 1,100 pages in it, including all of its verification rules and regulations and who can inspect what, when, and so forth. I was pretty heavily involved in those. I sat in more than 100 hours of meetings with Leonid Brezhnev trying to work those kind of things out. So I appreciate them. I think they had their role. I think they helped out at the time. But I'm not sure they're right for today's challenges. What are some of the challenges they face? First, just the simple timing. They don't even have a negotiator confirmed by the Senate yet. So that's going to happen and sworn in by the end of April. And if they want a treaty ratified, they're going to have to get it in front of the Senate by September. That would be about 10 times faster than we've ever done it before. Even if they give themselves till December and say, well, we'll just abide by it until it gets ratified, it would be 8 times faster than it's ever been done before. So the timing is very difficult. And we're not dealing with a very cooperative Russia here either. We're dealing with a Russia that is difficult to deal with. In particular, the Russian position, if I set aside Georgia and all kinds of extraneous stuff, oil prices and all sorts of stuff that the Russians make trouble over, if you just look at what they want to do about arms control and about this treaty, well, the numbers, they say, okay, we could agree to 1,500. We now have this SORT informal treaty. It's called SORT. So it says we'll get down to no more than 2,200, maybe as low as 1,700 by the end of 2012. They say, okay, we'll go to 1,500. But what do they include? They leave out about 10,000 of their weapons. They don't agree that a nuclear weapon is a nuclear weapon, regardless of where it's deployed and what it is. But in today's world, what counts for the threats we face from the terrorists, from irresponsible states, from proliferation, are all the weapons. And actually, some of these smaller ones or non-deployed ones are more risky than the ones that are highly controlled, sitting on top of missiles, particularly if the missiles are turned off for the moment. So that's a very difficult thing with numbers. There are things called counting rules. Now, try this on. We agreed in the SORT treaty to go down to at least 2,200. We've already announced that we've met that number. But guess what? If you count them, according to the counting rules that are in the SALT I treaty, you get close to 6,000. So we violate the SORT treaty. So if we were really to extend the counting rules, like a lot of people have said we ought to do right away, so that we could continue START 1, we would actually violate the other treaty by that rule. So how does that make any sense? And the Russians have said in lots of informal discussions at all kinds of levels that, well, they might make a few compromises, but the basic counting rules have to be maintained. So that's a tough one to deal with. The duration. The Russians wanted to go like 15 years. Why do they want it to go 15 years? Because they want to lock in place the idea that nuclear weapons are okay, we've agreed, regulatory process is fine, we like nuclear weapons, we like having them, they make up for our weaknesses, they help us in the world, they make us a great power. So let's get the United States to agree that all that's okay by signing a treaty that says what the rules are, and the rules will favor us. And they won't have anything to do with going to zero or trying actually to deal with the real threats that we face today. So that's a serious problem. And then, of course, the Russians always throw in all kinds of other extraneous issues that I won't elaborate here. So even if we got past all those and we got a treaty, I don't see how you get the Senate, where it only takes 34 votes to block a treaty to ratify this treaty. They're going to go along with a treaty that sets tight limits on the kinds of weapons we have, but leaves the 10,000 that they have that we don't have out of it. I don't think so. And the other things as well. We would gain some stuff. We would certainly extend the principle that weapons should at least be regulated, and we should certainly get some limits on Russian increases if we're worried about that. But remember, the Russians have 3 new strategic programs underway. New land-based missile, new submarines and sea-based missiles, restarting their bomber line. We don't have any, by the way. They have 3 going already. So what else are they going to do? So we say, okay, we'll get some limits on them doing more. They're really maxed out as it is. So I don't think we're going to get much limit on what they're going to be able to do compared to what they're already planning to do. But there is a price of this success. As I've said, it really validates Russia's dangerous nuclear strategy because it helps them maintain, they think, their status as a world-class great power by having nuclear weapons. We want to delegitimize the idea of nuclear weapons and say that their only purpose is to deter the use of nuclear weapons by others. So we don't want to reinforce that view. They say they need them to deter a potential U.S. or NATO conventional attack. They've actually said this, as if the U.S. or NATO is going to roll tanks up against Russia. I'll leave it at that. They say they need to help control the near abroad, the former Soviet states. I asked some of the Russians I know, so what does this mean? That if you'd had trouble bombing these airfields in Georgia, which they did, they had to use their backfire strategic bombers. They couldn't get their tactical airplanes down there. What would you have done? Dropped a nuclear weapon on Georgia? What are you going to do? They think these nuclear weapons help balance China's increasing power, but China's development of nuclear weapons is really very slow modernization compared to what Russia's about. Anyway, and I've mentioned these other things. These constraints are really on the U.S. Keeping these 10,000 weapons that they have, maybe only 3,000 are actively deployed, but they've got these others in storage. Keeping those out of the negotiations, putting these unnecessary verification counting rules on us, and then just ratifying their strategic weapons. There's also risk of the NPT. Continuing this two-tiered regime, there's a risk that we'll go next year and we'll agree to extend the NPT, and everybody say, okay, it's okay. We got another 5-year extension of the NPT. People sort of said that last time around. And, of course, nothing good's happened much from it since that happened. And we would, again, be locking in, for many years, a regime that cannot meet our greatest challenges. Most importantly to me, we would lose the momentum that we have for a new direction with a new administration in Washington and a new approach to these things. So let me talk about a little bit more of this business of the purpose of nuclear weapons, because a lot of people challenge me on this. They say, oh, no, there are all these other purposes. The purposes that the Russians say they have them for are valid. Now let me acknowledge up front that during the Cold War, our purpose of nuclear weapons was to use them first to stop a Soviet tank attack. A lot of people thought that was fanciful too at the time, particularly after the Russians developed short-range weapons to counter us. But that was our purpose. U.S. strategy was first use of nuclear weapons. Dick Ullman wrote the seminal article, I can't remember in what year, in Foreign Affairs, the first person to have the guts to suggest that maybe this was wrong and that we should have a no-first-use policy. And it shook everybody up. We didn't do it. We still haven't done it. But, as I've said, there's only one remaining purpose today, and the reality is nobody's going to use nuclear weapons in a non-nuclear scenario. We didn't use them in Vietnam. We didn't use them in Korea. Both places, we were in big trouble. We had a huge nuclear advantage, but we didn't use them then against a non-nuclear power. And, of course, we haven't used them against North Korea or Iran, and we wouldn't think about it. Other powers have the same kinds of constraints on them. Some people have said having a big nuclear force halts proliferation. We've seen that that doesn't work. But, as I've said, let's don't carry this too far, because there is a valid use of nuclear weapons, and that is to deter the use of nuclear weapons by others. And it's important to keep that in mind, because when you let that drop, then you come up with all kinds of suggestions that don't make any sense, that won't work. Now, how do we get to zero? First of all, we're going to have what I call a comprehensive nuclear control regime. Luckily, we have the International Atomic Energy Agency from the Non-Proliferation Treaty that knows how to catch cheaters pretty well. Now, their rules aren't strict enough. They need to be elaborated even more. But they did catch the North Koreans, and they did catch the Iranians in a lot of their cheating, even without the full cooperation of those states, and even without more elaborate rules. Now, if we're going to go to zero, their ability to catch cheating needs to be much, much tougher. This is an extremely challenging task to figure this out. This would take up all the academics who care about this in the United States would get grants for the next 15 years to work on this. Not even to talk about the U.S. labs and everybody else. It's a huge challenge. But I'm convinced that it can be done. This new regime has to apply to all nuclear materials, whether they're nuclear states or non-nuclear states. 95, 98, 99% of all the stuff in the world isn't controlled at all today because under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, if you were a nuclear state at the time of the treaty, you didn't have to subject yourself to any regulations. You know, you were a hedge fund. You didn't need regulations. And that's exactly what we were in Russia and China, Britain and France. That's got to stop. The two-tiered regime has to stop. It has to apply to materials used for research. They're left out. It has to apply to medical materials. They're left out. It has to apply to the weapons themselves. They're left out. It has to apply, in my opinion, to the spent fuel, the fuel that's left over after you have run fuel rods through a nuclear power plant. It does apply to the spent fuel for the non-nuclear powers because that fuel can be reprocessed and the plutonium separated. Not a trivial process, but something that's a lot easier than any other way to get your hands on bomb-making material. I think also that if we're going to be credible and go around to the world and say there's only one purpose for nuclear weapons, we need to accept that as our policy. And if we accept that as our policy, we need to bring our nuclear force, in line with the policy we say everybody else ought to live by. Well, we don't need all the weapons we have today if that's our only purpose for nuclear weapons. So it's going to be hard for us to convince the rest of the world if we ourselves act in an obviously inconsistent fashion and say, please agree that there's only this one purpose, and we're going to use that as a way to get down to zero nuclear weapons when we ourselves don't act like we care about it or agree with it. Now, how do you figure out how many we need? Well, here's my first point. Russia, since it has most of the rest of the weapons in the world, is really what I call the defining deterrence challenge from a conceptual standpoint. They're not an enemy. They don't really threaten us. But if you say, okay, we need to maintain a nuclear deterrent, who do you need to maintain a nuclear deterrent against? That's a challenge. We don't need many weapons to deter, the 2 or 3 that North Korea has. We don't need to deter Britain. We don't need to deter France. We don't need to deter Israel. We don't need to deter India. We don't need to deter, at least today, Pakistan. So where is it? It's Russia. So I go back to calculations that have been around for since the beginning of the nuclear arms race with the Soviet Union. And those calculations all come out at about the same number, that 500 surviving nuclear weapons that survive any kind of surprise attack could destroy all of Russia's significant industrial or military or economic targets. There are some guys in Omaha who do our targeting who claim you need more, but they get down to cities of less than 5,000 people, and they get down to some pretty small targets in order to come up with numbers that are greater than this. But there's no Russia left if you hit them with 500 nuclear weapons. So how many do you need to make sure that you have 500 to do that? I think you can convincingly conclude that 1,000 is enough, and I won't elaborate that here. But I'm happy to answer questions about how you get that.
But Jan, you don't need 500 to deter. You're not saying you have to destroy everything to deter.
I'm saying 500 is more than adequate. I'm saying 500 is very sufficient. I know that many people think it's way high. Okay, so I'm arguing that 500 is enough to deter, and 1,000 is enough to ensure 500. So that therefore, it's hard to argue that we need more than 1,000 weapons, regardless of what Russia has. And that's the key point. Regardless of what Russia has, we needed parity, sort of, maybe in the Cold War because we were threatening to use nuclear weapons first. And I can elaborate why that mattered. But that's gone. It's over. And we're still stuck. We still think, we have to negotiate this arms control treaty with the Russians and come down together like this and make sure that we're sort of, on the same numbers or the same wavelength with nuclear weapons. And when I ask the people who think that way, why do we need more? There's a lot of things Russia has more of that, we have less of, even in the military field. around the world, we never look for quantity. We look for quality. We look for what are our military needs. We have a lot less airplanes than some people do, but no Air Force in the world will even challenge our Air Force. They won't even come up off the ground. They know better. So it's the same situation here today with deterrence. Calculate what you need to accomplish the mission. Don't calculate how many the other guy has and say, well, we have to have the same number. So what are the 4 steps in general that we need to take in the United States if we're going to get to zero? Number 1, make the only remaining purpose of nuclear weapons that I've outlined, which is to deter the use of nuclear weapons by others. I prefer the phrase to prevent the use of nuclear weapons by others for technical reasons. Make that our official policy, and then reduce unilaterally to 1,000 weapons, which is enough for this only purpose. Number 3, to define and accept for our own purpose, accept as imposed on us a comprehensive nuclear control regime. Don't just define it and say, okay, rest of the world, you got to do this. Define it and say, we will live with it. Say that from the beginning. If you do those things, I believe that you can undertake a successful, vigorous diplomacy to achieve a consensus on both of these points, that that's the only legitimate purpose of nuclear weapons, and that we can build this comprehensive nuclear control regime. And once you've done that, you've actually eliminated the objections to going to zero. Now, there is an objection about, well, but people could cheat and have 1 or 2, and 1 or 2 would make a big difference. And we can talk about that some later if you want. I don't think 1 or 2 will make a big difference because you will get caught before you could do enough to make a big difference if you have the control regime in place. So I think the very regime you need to control the process of going to zero controls you after you're going to zero. Now here's a key point. Let's say you don't believe in zero. You don't want to go to zero. You think it's fanciful. You think it's nonsense. And you say, okay, we're going to regulate. If you think about it a lot and you say, okay, how are we going to regulate? It's kind of like the financial markets. I like this financial market analogy a lot. How are we going to regulate that? It turns out what you end up doing is putting in place, guess what? The same control regime. Because you need it to regulate what's there if you don't have zero. And it's pretty much the same as what you need to permit yourself to go to zero. So you need to do that no matter what. So that's actually a bit easier to convince people of than you might think, because it really makes sense to have it whether you're going to zero or not. And I think the main impediment today is U.S. diplomacy, our own willingness to accept these constraints that we want to impose on the rest of the world, and our overall strategy and approach. Now, we will need an alternative diplomacy from what we have today. We will have to demonstrate the American commitment up front with our actions as well as our words and our exhortations. And we need to start with our allies. We don't want to start with Russia. We want to start with our friends. We want to build an expanding circle. Since when is the right way to achieve a worldwide diplomatic outcome to go and start with the hardest cases and say, well, let's negotiate the very hardest case first before we have a whole lot of other people to help us? You know, this has been a mistake of American diplomacy for quite a while now. It was certainly a mistake in Iraq where we said, okay, we don't need everybody else. We'll go do this ourselves because, you know, we can't get everybody to do it on our terms. So build the circle first, build it as big as you can, bring as many into the tent as you can, and build out from there. Start with our allies. Some of those will be difficult. Japan, Turkey, France, they don't quite believe these things. Japan relies on our nuclear weapons to protect them against the threats of North Korea, perhaps China, perhaps more broadly. And they might get worried if we say, okay, our goal is to get to zero. Well, they would say, okay, but how are you going to protect us? So we have to convince them that, well, if everybody is at zero, and we're only going to zero if that's the case. We're not going to go to zero unless everybody goes to zero. And if that's the case, then you don't need our nuclear extended deterrent anymore. There's a lot involved in convincing them of that. This is not trivial. Same thing with Turkey. France has a kind of a Russian view that somehow or another, and they said it in their recent white book, as they call it, somehow or another, that nuclear weapons protect the state in a broad sense. But they don't specify what that means. So we have to convince France that they need to change their approach. But we will have, certainly the British, I think, would support an effort like this. Meanwhile, we continue the kind of pressure we have on Iran and North Korea. We don't want to have to reverse them in the process of going to zero. We want them to stop now before they have a viable nuclear program, for all the reasons that you heard. After we've done that, then we can move to nuclear states. Now, what's important here? There are actually 3 nuclear states, 2 specifically and 1 partially, who actually already accept this principle that the only purpose is to deter the use of others, because they have what's called a no first use policy that, as I mentioned, Dick first proposed in the 1980s, I believe, if not the 1990s, I think, but far back to the 80s. You remember it? 70s. Okay. Very early on. So if you have a no first use policy and you say, I will never use nuclear weapons unless somebody's used theirs against me first, so do you need any nuclear weapons if nobody else has any? Because you said you don't have any use for them except in response to somebody else using them. So it's pretty logical that if nobody else has them, you don't need them. So, and that's the rigorous policy of China and India, stated many times. So we don't really have to convince China and India. That's pretty good. Add them into our side of the argument here. The president of Pakistan, Zardari, has said the same thing, but it's not clear that his government as a whole and his military agree with that. So he's partially there. Israel has said some things that partially support this approach. They've talked about a nuclear-free zone, i.e., if everybody else got rid of theirs in the region, we'd get rid of ours. More importantly for Israel, if you go back and you think, why do they have nuclear weapons? When they first developed them, they faced a huge conventional threat from Egypt, a huge conventional threat from Jordan, big armies. And they had a small army, and it was weak, and they were worried about it. By 73, they built up enough that they won the war, but just barely, and only with some last-minute U.S. support. They won the war in 73. Since then, they've significantly increased their conventional capability, and they reached a peace treaty with Egypt and with Jordan, which, for all of its problems, has actually led to the elimination of those immediate, large conventional threats. So the original reason they got their nuclear weapons is gone. I'm convinced that they keep them today largely because of their worry about Iran. So again, their main reason for having nuclear weapons is to prevent the use of nuclear weapons by others, not to deter some kind of conventional attack. So I think that this diplomacy is feasible. Not easy, but feasible. And when you think through it, it's not nearly as fanciful as it might seem if you just think of it only in big picture terms. Now, what about Russia? I didn't say anything about them yet. Of course we should engage Russia, but we should be prepared to wait until they join the consensus of heading towards zero. Let's don't rush along with Russia to try to get some kind of a new Cold War type treaty, which has all of those negatives that I outlined before. Well, I'm going to wrap up with the comments of a great nuclear strategist, Humphrey Bogart. Anybody who is younger than me in this room won't know where the quote came from, but those of you who aren't will know where the quote came from. And maybe a few younger film buffs will know where the quote came from. You're going to get on that plane, and if you don't, you'll be sorry. Not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon and for the rest of your life. Anyway, Bogart says that to Elsa, the somewhat attractive, as she's hesitating about getting on the plane to Lisbon and out of Casablanca. So that's what we need to do. We need to get on this plane, or we'll be sorry. Maybe not today. And I'll end with excuse me, I punched the wrong button here. I'll end with a little more serious quote, but one that I really love, from what Obama said in Berlin. This is the moment when we must renew the goal of a world without nuclear weapons. The two superpowers that face each other across the wall of this city came too close, too often, to destroying all we have built and all we love. With that wall gone, we need not stand idly by and watch the further spread of the deadly atom. It is time to secure all loose nuclear materials, to stop the spread of nuclear weapons, and to reduce the arsenals from another era. This is the moment to begin the work of seeking the peace of a world without nuclear weapons. So thank you very much. I'll be happy to take that. I'd be happy to.
We have about a half hour for questions, and Jen Lodal will moderate his own questions.
Yes, ma'am.
So am I to assume that the policy and the plan that you outlined here is very close? It's not the same as the policy and plan of the Obama administration?
It's very close, and it's an elaboration of, more details, of what candidate Obama said in his campaign. He's just getting started. He doesn't have his key people confirmed. He hasn't proceeded very far in his policy yet. And so we'll see whether, as president, he adopts this or not. It is, and I know I'm on the record here on the cameras, and I don't mean this as a criticism of our new Secretary of State, who I'm just delighted with and who I think has done a terrific job for the country. But she doesn't have her key team in place either. And I think she made a bit of a mistake when, after her meeting with the Russian foreign minister, she said, we will have a new START 1 replacement treaty by the end of the year. If for no other reasons, knowing Russian behavior, that pretty much gives up our negotiating leverage because we say we have to have it. So, you know.
And are you in the loop to communicate with these people?
Well, I communicate with some of them. I live in Washington. They're my friends, and I know them. But the ones I communicate with either aren't appointed, aren't confirmed, or don't listen to me anyway.
Do other nuclear experts like yourself share this very guarded optimism of a very Herculean task?
There are sort of three camps, in my view. Okay? There's the ban the bomb camp. I'm caricaturing them. I'm being unfair to them. Okay? But the people who say, this makes no sense at all. These things are illegal. They're immoral. How can anybody even think about them? Why do we have them? And they really tend to push for unilateral American disarmament in the first instance. So that's one camp. Then there's the sort of steady as she goes camp. All right? Those who feel that what we need to do is take the institutions we have and build on them. Most of the people in the second camp actually disagree with zero as an ultimate goal. They, for one or another reason, they either think it's infeasible to ever get there and that trying to get there will make the world less safe, or more fundamentally, they actually believe that nuclear weapons make the world safer because they prevent large-scale conventional wars. There won't be another World War II, which would be a catastrophe with modern weapons, etc. And they think that's enough of a threat that it's worth keeping nuclear weapons to prevent that from happening. So that's the second camp. People who aren't really very excited about going to zero and think that the existing institutions can get us there. And then there's the people like myself who believe that there is only one stable outcome, and that's zero, and that other outcomes are not stable, and we need to get there for our own security reasons, because we don't want a pleasure boat showing up in New York Harbor or Miami Harbor or Sydney Harbor or anywhere else in the world exploding a crude nuclear weapon anytime for all the reasons that I said. I would say that the third camp is the smallest, okay? And that everybody else kind of split between the first two. But I think it's growing. And I think one of the adherents that the third camp has, and this is what makes it hopeful, is the President of the United States, because he said it over and over again in his campaign. Yes?
I agree with a lot of what you say, but I want to push you on one point. It seems to me that the talking about nuclear weapons only being useful for deterrence gives them value, and that in thinking about a stable zero world, the issue is not, what do nuclear weapons mean to us now? Where does the consensus finally end up at the end of the Cold War, which is that they're only good for deterrence? But if a dictator had a nuclear weapon, what could he do with it, or 3 or 50? And so I'm not I agree a lot with the goals and stuff. I'm not sure that I see how to get to zero, stable zero, if you still want to say nuclear weapons are these magic, valuable, terrific weapons, or even limited, modestly limited, valuable. As long as they're valuable, people want to get them, right?
Well, it's a very good question. First of all, let me emphasize that I'm not talking about deterrence in a general sense. That's why I don't like the word deterrence. As I said, I prefer the phrase prevent the use of nuclear weapons by others. So their only purpose is to prevent the use of nuclear weapons by others. So this dictator and so forth, if he agreed with this, which he wouldn't, otherwise he wouldn't have built them. So that's counter-hypothetical. But anyway, if he did, he wouldn't need them because nobody else would have them. So it's only this very limited sense. And I move back and forth between deterrence because it's a more commonly understood term, and my phrase of prevent the use of nuclear weapons by others. So that's point one. Point two, would the dictator try to build some? Yeah, he would. Okay. So what do we do about that? Well, the first thing we do is we build this comprehensive nuclear control regime, and we get everybody to sign up to it. And we make it very hard on anybody who won't sign up to it. And we certainly don't give them any more nuclear technology, nuclear help, nuclear power plants, nuclear anything, as to the extent we can, until they sign up to it. So that's the challenge, is getting people to sign up to the control regime in the first place, in my opinion. If they have signed up to the control regime, and if you don't get them all to sign up, I think it's very hard to get the world to zero. You might get the world heading down towards zero, which would be an improvement, but you won't get them to zero until everybody's signed up. So you only really have to think about what does it mean for the dictator to get his 2 or 3 in a world in which the control regime exists. Because your situation doesn't arise until the control regime exists, in my model at least. So what does it mean? Well, first of all, it's hard for him to get even 2 or 3, even 1, if the control regime is in place, because it's likely to catch his activities. Now, a nuclear power that had a bunch of nuclear weapons material, and, so Iran has some nuclear weapons material, and they put it in Ahmadinejad's basement and save it, and we don't know that it's there because we didn't have good accounting ahead of time. That's a little more possible, but in a way less threatening. The dictator getting it somehow or another through the control regime is very difficult. All right, let's assume he does. Okay, let's carry the thought experiment another step. Terrible dictator somewhere gets a nuclear weapon and starts threatening the world with it. Okay? The rest of the world has huge conventional superiority, can wipe his country out, can wipe him off the face of the earth. And remember that the nuclear powers, you're not going to eliminate the breakout capability. This is a detail I didn't go into in my talk. But the capability to develop a nuclear weapon, again, is going to be there. It's going to be there not only for the current nuclear powers, it's already there today. Japan, Germany, all these places, they have all the technology. They've got all the necessary capabilities to do it rapidly if they chose to, some more rapidly than others. But they could do it. So you're going to have to live with that. And the point is that if anybody does do that, the others can do it. So the reverse applies. So it's not very hard, and it doesn't take very long to get back to the point where you can have nuclear weapons to deter the use of nuclear weapons by others if the regime breaks down. Hopefully, you'll be able to convince even that dictator that this is the fact. And not only is this the fact, but that if he does it, he's going to be wiped off the face of the earth. Anyway, so hopefully it won't happen. But it's a risk. I think it's a risk that's a lot lower risk than the risk we take with the present structure that we have. So you have to compare those two risks. I think it, first of all, is lower than you might think it is in the beginning for the reasons I just set forth. And second of all, in any case, I think it's lower than the risk of continuing with the regime we have in place today. Sir.
Would you give us your view, please, on the Senate testimony that took place about a year ago, in which this testimony was something to the effect that our deterrent force was not very credible anymore because of a lack of testing over a long period of time and because of the fact that many of our systems are based on things like vacuum tubes that are just not very reliable anymore? Is that valid?
No. First of all, our primary deterrent force are our submarines. And I think this year we carried out a submarine launch ballistic missile test, and it was successful. And it was approximately, what was the number? Do you remember that number? Anybody in the room remember the number? I remember some number very high, like the 285th test that we've done, and every one had worked. There's no missile that has ever been close to that successful. I may have that number way off. I don't, but anyway, it's the largest number ever of any missile by far. So these systems do work. They are reliable, and they are modern, and they have been continuously modernized. So I don't know where that came from. There was a commission chaired by Secretary Schlesinger that was set up in the wake of this incident where the 4 nuclear weapons were loaded on some bombers, and it very strongly urged that more effort be put into the nuclear force. Now, the thrust of that commission was, if you're going to have nuclear weapons, make them safe, make them secure, and make sure they work right. It didn't really go to the question of whether we should have them at all or not. It just said, this is not right, and we can't have an incompetent system. It's dangerous, and that's true. Yes, sir.
It would appear to me that the success of the control regime would be dependent on the impartiality of the IAEA and their inspections. How can you sell that impartiality to the people that you need to get to buy into the system?
Well, I think there's 2 answers to that. The easier answer, but probably not quite adequate, is that if the regime is, if it is imposed on every state in the world, impartiality gets a little bit easier to have. In other words, everybody is subject to the same rules, and that's not true today. So today you have a lot of arguments about impartiality or not, because states have different rules under which they operate. The second answer is that I don't propose that the IAEA per se be the institution responsible for the comprehensive nuclear control regime, because I share basically some of your concerns. So I think it will probably take a different, newer kind of an institution that deals with some of those problems. So I think that's a big challenge, to define that institution and get that accepted also. So all of these things are challenges. They're multi-year, if not multi-decade, diplomatic challenges for us, but we got to get on the airplane. So I basically agree that it's certainly not structured today. You know, it has an almost trivial budget. It has a budget of $100 million a year. It's supposed to, I mean, I'm talking about a system that would have a budget of tens of billions of dollars a year in order to operate. A very small price, by the way, for what you would get. I mean, we now talk in terms of tens of trillions of dollars with our new financial problem. For those of you who don't know, a trillion is 1,000 billion. Yes, ma'am.
How do you prevent non-state actors from acquiring these weapons, especially when deterrence really...
Well, that number one is your main goal. I'm sorry, I cut you off. Excuse me.
I mean, it seems like this plan is mostly geared towards states and their nuclear weapons, and how, when deterrence really isn't a threat to these non-state actors and to terrorist groups, how do you prevent them from acquiring weapons?
Well, because deterrence doesn't work with them, you can only prevent them from getting nuclear weapons by keeping them from getting the material. Focus on the material. They have the technology. They know the technology. They can get suicide bombers who have PhDs in nuclear physics, you know. So they can get the technology. If they don't have it, they do have it. But they don't have the material, because the material requires either a nuclear power plant to make plutonium, followed on by a reprocessing plant to reprocess it, number one. Number two, it requires a very big plant to enrich uranium. And we've seen Ahmadinejad on television with his, how many does he have today? 4,000? 6,000 maybe.
2,000 aren't operating.
2,000 operating, centrifuges, you know, rows and rows and rows. And even all those would take a year or two to make enough for one bomb if it was all devoted to making bombs, and none of it was devoted to power plants at all. So that's very hard to do. Or number three, you steal it. Okay? So the way you keep non-state actors from getting a nuclear weapon is you keep them from getting the material, and the way you keep them from getting the material is the comprehensive nuclear control regime. That's why I say you need that whether you're going to zero or not. Now, I think that that control regime works a lot better at zero. It's a lot easier to detect cheating if all you're trying to do is to detect some signal out of the noise, and you don't have to measure how big the signal is. For those of you who occasionally go to the engineering quad over here, you know what I'm talking about here. That's just an easier detection problem across the board. So that's why I put so much emphasis on the control regime, because it's really the key to keeping the non-state actors out of the game. Now, I will say that in addition to working better at zero, I don't think you'll get the world to agree to the control regime unless it's part of a broader goal of going to zero. It's too hard to do. And if the world believes that this regime we have of allowing nuclear weapons and asserting all kinds of purposes way beyond the purpose that I've said for nuclear weapons exists, in that kind of a world, it's very hard to see going to this kind of a control regime, because the nuclear states, like the United States to begin with, will say, oh, we have security reasons. We can't let anybody inspect our stuff because it's secret. It's a lot easier to get them to let them inspect your stuff if you're planning to get rid of it all anyway. And if you say, you know, its use is very limited now and is going to zero, that's a lot easier to do. So I think that they all go together, even though in principle you could have a control regime that could keep it out of the hands of non-state actors without the requirement of going to zero. In principle, I concede that point. But in practice, I think it's very hard to get one without the other. Let's see. Yes, sir. You were.
Sir, you've said a couple of times the only legitimate purpose for nukes is to prevent the use of nukes by others. And then you said as a corollary to that no one will use nukes in a non-nuclear scenario. And I'm just trying to wrap my mind around that. Like if you have a state which is, you know, conventionally weaker than its adversaries,
right,
but has nukes,
right, like
that state has a very strong, you know, and has a very strong motivation to at least state publicly that if, you know, its adversaries come at it and, you know, threaten its existence, that it's going to respond with nukes. Do you think those states are not telling the truth?
No, I think they are.
They would respond with nukes.
No, I think that if a small nuclear power, okay, against a large non-nuclear power has an advantage, there's no question about it. But there won't be such a circumstance, because we're not going to give up our nuclear weapons until everybody's agreed to do it and there's a verified plan in place to do it. So we will not be a large nuclear power, a large non-nuclear power, nor will anybody else for that matter, France, Britain.
Jan, I think if I understood the question is, maybe a reason Iran wants nuclear weapons is to make sure that you're not conventionally attacked by something.
I'm sure that is the case. I'm sure that is the case. I said use, okay? But think about Iran, first of all, today. I'm talking about a world in which they're not facing non-nuclear powers. They're facing other nuclear powers. All right? So let's start with where we are. Nuclear Iran, nuclear other powers. Will Iran really use that nuclear weapon, knowing that we know they did it, and knowing that that means the destruction of Iran, either by nuclear weapons or by conventional attack, whatever? I argue probably not. Not even those guys. Certainly not the mullahs. Probably not Ahmadinejad. They won't do it today. All right? So let's look at the other extreme, then we'll come back to the intermediate, the difficult transition. The other extreme is nobody has nuclear weapons. Okay? And they think about, okay, maybe we'll sneak in one, and then all of a sudden we'll have this one nuclear weapon. And all of a sudden that'll give us great power against everybody else. I doubt it. I won't elaborate that because I've already really answered that question. All right, so the point is that the minute they start trying to build nuclear weapons, the deal's off. The non-nuclear, the zero world is finished. If we don't catch them and stop them with our control regime, okay, the zero world is finished. So we don't ever let that arise. We don't ever let the situation where there are non-nuclear powers trying to deter, small nuclear powers trying to deter our big conventional forces come into existence.
Right. The only part that I'm confused about is that in my scenario, assuming the success of what you're saying, that we get rid of all nuclear weapons,
Okay.
wouldn't that small nuclear power that was trying to deter the larger non-nuclear power now just be royally screwed? In the sense that that larger non-nuclear power will now roll across its border?
No, because you convince them that it didn't do any good for them to have those nuclear weapons in the first place. Go back to my first argument.
Because they weren't acting as a deterrent.
That's right. Because they're deterred by our nuclear weapons. You see, if we both have them, we're both deterred. If we don't have them, we neither need them. To oversimplify. Hal?
John, just trying to understand the timing. Now, you're getting down to lower and lower numbers. Now, you got down to 1,000. And at that point insisted that the U.S. has to be sure that we have enough survivable warheads. So that's our calculation. Assume the other guy will have some. And then if you go down to 200 or 100, it's going to be the same kind of calculation, I guess. If people have 100, they're going to make sure that some survive. You don't have to have 500.
I don't think it's the same. I don't. Go ahead and finish your question, but I don't accept that premise, and I'll tell you why in a minute.
Okay, but let me state that at the moment. Now you're going to zero, and you know that the Russians, let's say, or the U.S. can hide hundreds of weapons. I mean, there's no way to account more precisely for how much fissile material they make and so on. I'm not saying they will, but the U.S. is going to think, well, the Russians could have hit 200 weapons. So in a sense, you're down to zero. You're at the same place that our strategy up to now insisted can't happen. That is that we don't have any nuclear weapons left, and those guys might have some or more or a lot. The kind of thing we want to make sure, that's why we say we have to have some survivable weapons if they attack us first. So how do you make that transition? The mindset that somehow you have to have survivable warheads, and then at zero you say, well, I'm not that. Somehow I could accept the idea that he could have hidden some, and I don't.
Now, to show the rest of you in this room why this is such a hard problem to deal with, Hal is one of the 2 or 3 most important experts in the nation on this. Chris is one of the others. And this is hard for him. It's hard for me. Okay, so it's hard because it's hard. So I accept that it's hard. All right, here's the answer, I believe. Number one, I don't think that you can get to 200, let's say, or 500 or some number like that between us and Russia, and 100 or 2 with the other nuclear powers in a world where the political tensions exist today. You're going to have to deal with some of those political tensions in the process of getting there, or you won't have gotten there in the first place. So I don't think the kind of relationship we have with Russia today, which leaves us feeling, as a backup at least, we need to keep some kind of nuclear deterrent, is likely to exist. So I think that you actually don't do the same deterrence calculation when you're on that downward glide slope that you do today, because I think by definition, if you got there, you're in a better world, and you don't have to do that. Number 2, you said the nuclear powers can hide a few hundred because we can't really count better than that. And that's certainly true today. But, let's say out of this billions and billions we're going to spend on this control regime, we gave, let's say, merely $500 million to the program for science and global security at Princeton. Now, with $500 million, could you guys figure out how to build this nuclear control regime? Okay. And all you got to do is say yes, and you get the money. No, excuse me, I'm teasing my longtime friend here. But the serious answer is that it comes back to the control regime. The control regime I envision, but haven't rigorously defined, that's for sure. But envision just wouldn't let that happen because it would involve no-notice challenge inspections. It would involve disclosures and accounting and stuff that had to add up, and bottom line, and all that stuff, better than our corporate accounting adds up. Mm-hmm. And so, you'd have to have a lot of stuff in place that would give you high confidence that nobody had squirreled away hundreds. Maybe they can squirrel away a few, no question about it. But I think that those few are pretty much unusable. So I think that's the other part of the answer.
That's a fair point. It could be stabilized in a way. Each country will say, well, we're not sure the other guy hasn't I don't have any. We're not sure the other guy.
So
so you're always a little.
We've argued that with smallpox. We've argued that. I mean, that's why we kept some smallpox, right? We argued that, and that, by the way, is a very strong argument. I mean, I said there's three big schools and there are lots of sub-schools. One sub-school are the people who believe that the most stable outcome is a very small number of nuclear weapons like this in order to kind of keep it from coming back. I don't think so, but that's a long discussion, especially if it's acknowledged. Yes, please.
Perhaps my question is whether it's plausible in a world where, as you joke, the United States Air Force can't keep track of its own nuclear weapons to assume...
Didn't keep track of it.
Well,
Don't say it can't.
did not keep track of their own nuclear weapons, that we would be able to sort of construct a new international bureaucracy from scratch that would be able to keep track of everyone's, and then that the backup scenario would be sort of a free-for-all where everybody races to get as many nukes because it turns out that Kim Jong-il or somebody else did hide one in their basement.
Well, that's not the backup scenario, by the way. The backup scenario is you have very strong conventional forces and you create coalitions where you pull together all the strong conventional forces in the world and you tell the power that you're catching cheating that, turn it around and so, that's step one, is you try to reverse it, and you use your existing power to do it. And the other thing is that the backup scenario isn't to just build as many as you can. All I'm saying is that if all else failed, you have that option available to you, and the cheating power knows you have that option available to you, and if you also have a coalition of the rest of the world against you, maybe you'll not do it in the first place, and if you do it, you'll reverse it. So I think that it's more subtle than you suggested in terms of how this would play out were it to occur. But let me also say that the problem the Air Force had and the problem with loose nukes is a very specific problem that needs to not wait for this zero world before it's solved. And we need to get on with dealing with that. And there's a lot of governmental and non-governmental effort to do that. And President Obama, as you can see in those statements that I read to you, it's off the board now, specifically isolated the problem of loose nukes and said we got to get that under control right away and make sure these things are carefully accounted for. And I don't want to either over or under dramatize the Air Force's mistake. It led to the immediate firing, and rightly so, of the Secretary of Air Force and the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, the top two officers. So that shows how crucial it was, how large an issue it was in the mind of our Secretary of Defense, and congratulations to him for doing that, in my opinion. So, but on the other hand, it was a matter of complacency and not capability in that case. In the other circumstance, it's a matter of capability. One other thing I'll say, it's not just an international bureaucracy that does this. These systems don't work by having an international bureaucracy try against a hostile party to verify everything. They got to have a cooperative party. That's part of the regime, is that everybody cooperates, and they provide reporting and accounting against which you can do your test. So it's much more like an auditor than it is like trying to do your own accounting from scratch. And if you build a system like that correctly, you can find discrepancies, as the IAEA did with very limited resources and very limited authorities in Korea, North Korea, and in Iran. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, in 2005, I worked for Mayors for Peace, which was founded by Mayor Kiba from Hiroshima. It was an interesting experience because I was the international deputy campaign manager for their 2020 Vision campaign, which was to eradicate nuclear weapons by the year 2020. I imagine you're familiar with the organization. And when I started, there were about 400 mayors, and at the end of the NPT conference, there were about 1,000. And now I believe there are almost 2,400 mayors from 130 countries. And I know that the U.S. Conference of Mayors has signed on to the 2020 Vision Campaign, and I think that many of the U.S. mayors really saw the light after, 9/11, because they realized that, something as devastating as a nuclear bomb, that, it's not going to be the government that saves their city. It's going to be the mayor that's going to have to get out there and deal with the immediate damage because communication, et cetera, et cetera. And so my experience in working with this group is that it had a real underutilized potential to motivate political will around the world, and I don't think it's been taken seriously by government officials. And I just wanted to get your opinion on, because they seem to me the conduit between the people and government. And we had several of the secret cities from the Soviet Union. We had the mayor of London. We had very influential St. Petersburg, and we had very influential mayors around the world. So I just wanted to get your feedback on that.
Well, first of all, I am familiar with the organization. I've been in both Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I've met with the mayors of both towns. I have some cufflinks given to me by the mayor of Nagasaki, which I still wear. And I know it's a very, very tragic, and it's for that reason that I cherish those mementos of meeting with him. And so congratulations on the work that your organization has done. Now, I do think that building public awareness is important. I'm currently involved in the creation of Inconvenient Truth type movie by the same people who made Inconvenient Truth, that hopefully will get made and be available within a year or less, that talks about the inconvenient truth that we still face a nuclear threat, in much of the way it talked about the inconvenient truth of global climate change. So I think things like this are very, very important. I'm a signator of the declaration of an organization called Global Zero, which says some things that, frankly, I can argue with, and that in this forum I might say, well, they didn't say this quite right or that quite right. But I so strongly supported their basic goals and shared the views of many of the other signatories that, I felt very comfortable signing on to these kinds of things. So I think they're very important. I think that the key to these organizations is to focus on the new world that we're in and not inadvertently blame all of the people who've been involved in our existing structure of nuclear deterrence. I had these wonderful discussions with the Catholic bishops in the 1980s when they did a pastoral letter on nuclear weapons. And Cardinal Bernardine, at that time, he wasn't cardinal yet, Archbishop, was the chairman of the Catholic Bishops' Council. And they wrote a wonderful pastoral letter. And they did not say it was immoral or against Catholic teachings for a bomber pilot to be trained and operate as a nuclear bomber pilot. And because they understood that the system was designed to prevent all nuclear war, that the system was designed for deterrence, not for use of nuclear weapons, and that the intentionality criteria was met because there was no intention to use these weapons against other people, and the consequential criterion was met because if it worked, there would be no nuclear war. So I think that it's very important not to demonize the people who've been associated with the old policies. I think it's equally important to say very strongly that the old policies are no longer the right policies, and we need a new set of policies for the new age and for the new threats, and we go forward from here. So that's my only advice, if you will, to organizations such as yours, and I haven't read the mayor's statements, and they may well be consistent with this.
Their 2020 vision campaign is very consistent with what you've been talking about
Terrific.
here. So I would suggest you get familiar because
I will get the
it
information.
really is.
I will
It's very aligned.
Well, I think we have time for one or two more. Oh, you go last. I'm not going to fall into that trap. Sir.
I think you've laid out sort of a convincing picture that, says, getting to zero and, managing that scenario can sort of solve the nuclear side of the question. But I'm wondering if you could address the concerns of the second camp a little bit that you laid out. People who think that nuclear weapons make conflict less likely between great powers because they raise the costs of potential conflict to unacceptable levels. And so if you do solve the nuclear side of the equation, is there a way that sort of you also envision this process, transforming the international system a little bit in a way that if you just take nuclear weapons out of the international system, conflict doesn't become more likely?
Well, I think technology has transformed the international system. Tomorrow, Professor Shin, who's behind you, and his class on technology and foreign policy, we're going to talk about this some there. But I think this is actually a very good example. World War II is no longer technologically possible. You say, what in the world do you mean by that? And the answer is that precision-guided munitions make it impossible. You can't conduct a big tank attack anymore because PGMs can destroy the tanks fairly rapidly and fairly cheaply. So the old huge wars that we're used to are not only politically no longer viable, they're actually not militarily viable in any case. So it's very hard to conceive of a conventional major war against major powers. This is why we argue about how many F-22s, if any, do we need, since it only works in that kind of an environment. Now, I happen to think we need some because I think we want to make sure that because it's part of the reason that it doesn't work anymore is because things like that exist. So, let's just make sure we keep the lid on, if you will. So I think that that's the first thing you do is you make sure you have a proper conventional force balance so that there's no opportunity for this to arise. If for some reason or another, we had, heaven forbid, a really incompetent, government for 8 years, I can't imagine. But let's say we had an incompetent government for a period of time and they did a bunch of wrong things and all of a sudden we didn't keep a proper force balance in the world and this did arise and we were really in big trouble about this and we felt that only nuclear deterrence could work. Remember, this is not for the rest of human history necessary kind of situation. So you have it in extremis out, just like almost all these treaties have an in extremis escape clause. So you do have an in extremis escape clause. You wouldn't like to use it. You wouldn't want to use it. It would really put the world in terrible trouble, and you shouldn't have allowed the world to get to the point where you needed to use it. But I don't think that system as a whole is less stable than where we are today, given today's conventional force technology. The last question, sir.
Thank you. I have a minor comment that then flows into a bigger question. The comment picks up on Hal Fiveson's remark. In my view, historical uncertainties about the amount of high-enriched uranium and plutonium produced in the major programs is a major challenge on the road to zero. I wouldn't say it's insurmountable, but I think it's a major challenge. And my question is really a bigger version of that and some of the other questions you've been asked. Suppose you were in the Obama administration, and suppose that you had been given the task of President's special advisor for the road to zero, or for getting to zero. I would imagine that part of your mandate would be create a red team and tell me what the biggest problems are with this approach. And you've talked, in part because of the questions, in part because of your survey of the other camps, you've talked a bit about that. But I'd like to ask you to tell us what you think the 2 or 3 most important objections that have to be overcome. Not political objections, but substantive objections to this world of zero weapons, to proceeding in that way.
I think the biggest objection is that it's impossible politically to articulate this in such a way that doesn't lead to an unstoppable political movement inside the U.S. in favor of unilateral nuclear disarmament. That you can see in a very well-informed audience here these subtle distinctions between the purpose of nuclear weapons, the limited purpose of preventing the use of nuclear weapons by others, and all other purposes is a hard point to get across. And it's a lot easier to say, well, there isn't any purpose really anymore. Why in the world don't we lead the world by getting rid of ours and then the others will follow? So I think, to me, that's the first thing I would say to the president, is that you got to be very clear in how you articulate this and how you roll it out to make people understand that we're not saying these things are immoral. We're not saying it's been wrong to have them. We're not saying we can get rid of them unilaterally. Actually, if you go back and you look at candidate Obama's even his website, if you go look on there, he explicitly says that, we're not going to unilaterally eliminate. He says, I'm not in favor of unilateral disarmament. But I think that's number one. I think number two is actually the control regime and what we're talking about for the reasons that you have brought up, among others. How do we solve these problems? And maybe you need $1 billion instead of $500 million up here to figure it out. They are very complicated, and I don't belittle those at all. I might tease you, but I don't belittle the complexity of trying to figure out how to build a control regime in such a way that it is workable. I think that step one, you have to define it in a convincing way, and then you got to sell it to the rest of the world. Now, we can bring some of our partners in the definition phase also, but we better have something that's pretty convincing before we go try to sell it. Because if we have something that's not really going to work and isn't really convincing and we try to go sell it, we won't get another chance right away to go back and do that. So those are the two things I would focus on.
Well, with that abuse in my role as moderator,